The sky spat fire as the Arizona sun descended into its daily grave, painting the dusty streets of San Andreas in hues of crimson and gold. It was 1872, and the small settlement nestled in the southeastern corner of the territory had seen its fair share of hardships, droughts, outlaws, and the ever-present tension between settlers and the Apache people whose land they now occupied. But none of those troubles compared to the spectacle of that evening. A woman unlike any other, slumped against the wall of the general store, her frame so imposing that passers-by crossed to the other side of the street rather than come close. Daniel Gray Zimmerman watched from the doorway of his modest room at the Silver Spur Inn. At 32, he'd learned to keep to himself, to observe rather than engage. 15 years of drifting since leaving his Pennsylvania home had taught him the value of silence. A man could learn a lot by keeping his mouth shut and his eyes open. And right now, his eyes were fixed on the Apache woman whose head nearly touched the store's awning when she stood at her full height. The townspeople gave her a wide berth, mothers pulling their children close, men making the sign of the cross or spitting tobacco in her direction. Gray had heard the whispers that she was a witch, an abomination, a monster, that the U.S. Army had captured her after a raid on her village, brought her to town as a curiosity, then abandoned her when orders came to move further west. They'd left her chained to the hitching post outside the sheriff's office, with clear instructions that no one was to feed or help her. "Let her die slow," the cavalry captain had said, loud enough for the whole town to hear. "Make an example for the rest of those savages." That had been 3 days ago. She hadn't begged, hadn't made a sound. Just sat there, her obsidian eyes staring straight ahead, her hands bound with chains that would have held back a stallion. Gray scratched his beard and considered turning away, going back to the worn copy of Don Quixote he'd been reading. It wasn't his business. It wasn't his fight. He was passing through San Andreas, like he passed through every town a ghost, leaving no footprints in the sand. But something in the way she held herself, with dignity even as her massive frame grew weaker by the hour, stirred something in him. Gray had spent a lifetime avoiding trouble. He ducked the war between the states by heading west when the first shots were fired at Fort Sumter. He'd walked away from bar fights and blood feuds. He'd never taken sides. "Damn it all," he muttered, reaching for his hat. The street was quiet as Gray crossed it, the boardwalk creaking under his weight. The Apache woman didn't move as he approached, though her eyes dark as a midnight desert followed his every step. "Evening, madam," he said softly, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. From his jacket pocket, he pulled a bundle wrapped in a clean handkerchief. "Thought you might be hungry." It wasn't much, half a loaf of sourdough bread and a strip of jerky he'd been saving, but it was food. He unwrapped it and placed it on the ground beside her, just within reach of her chained hands. Then he stepped back, giving her space. She didn't move, didn't speak, just looked at him with those unfathomable eyes. "Go on," he urged. "Ain't poisoned or nothing, just bread and meat." For a long moment she remained still. Then, with deliberate slowness, she reached for the bread. Her hands were large but graceful, her fingers calloused but clean. She tore off a small piece, sniffed it, and placed it in her mouth. Gray nodded, satisfied, and turned to leave. "Dawee." The word stopped him. He turned back, brow furrowed. "That's my name," she said, her English accented but clear. "Dawee Ahtone." Gray swallowed hard. He hadn't expected her to speak, and certainly not in English. "Gray Zimmerman," he replied, tipping his hat. "Pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Ahtone." The hint of a smile touched her lips. "Not Miss Widow." Before Gray could respond, a shout came from down the street. "Hey, what are you doing, mister?" Sheriff Boone was striding toward them, hand resting on the butt of his revolver. You know the rules. No feeding the prisoner. Gray stood his ground, though every instinct told him to walk away. Didn't know bread was against the law, Sheriff. Don't get smart with me, stranger. That Apache witch killed 6 soldiers before they brought her in. Gray glanced at Dawee, whose expression revealed nothing. That true, madam. 3, she corrected calmly. And only after they killed my husband and child. The sheriff's face reddened. See, she admits it. Now step away before I arrest you for interfering with justice. Gray studied the lawman. Boone was shorter than him, but broader, with a mean look about him that spoke of a man who enjoyed the power his badge gave him. Behind him, a small crowd was gathering, curious faces watching the confrontation. This ain't justice, Gray said quietly. This is torture. You can't leave a human being to starve in the street. She ain't human, Boone spat. Look at the size of her. 7 feet if she's an inch. It ain't natural. Natural enough, Gray replied. I've seen taller men. But she ain't a man, is she? The sheriff stepped closer. Last warning. Walk away. Gray weighed his options. He could back down, return to his room, pack his things, and be gone by morning. That's what he'd always done, avoided conflict, moved on when trouble arose. The smart play. But Dawee's eyes were on him, watching, waiting. No, he said, the word feeling strange in his mouth. I don't think I will. The sheriff's hand moved to his gun, but Gray was faster. His revolver cleared leather before Boone's fingers had fully wrapped around his weapon's grip. Now, Sheriff, Gray said, keeping his voice steady despite the hammering in his chest. Let's not do something we'll both regret. I'm not looking for trouble. Just want to make sure this lady gets treated fairly. Boone's eyes darted from Gray's gun to his face, calculating. You're making a big mistake, friend. One piece of Apache trash ain't worth dying over. Maybe not, Gray agreed. But a man's gotta draw a line somewhere. This is mine. A tense silence fell over the street. The gathering crowd murmured, their loyalties divided. Some nodded in agreement with Gray, others glared at him for defending the Apache woman. Finally, Sheriff Boone stepped back, hands raised slightly. Have it your way, but both of you better be gone by sunrise, and you take responsibility for her. She kills anyone else, it's on your head. Gray nodded. Fair enough. With a final glare, the sheriff turned and stalked away, the crowd parting before him. When he was gone, Gray holstered his weapon and knelt beside Dawee. Keys to these chains, he said. Where would they be? Sheriff's office, she replied. Small drawer in his desk. Gray considered this. Breaking into the sheriff's office would be a step too far, but leaving her chained up wasn't an option either. Wait here, he said, then realized the absurdity of his words. I'll be right back. The blacksmith shop was still open, the forge glowing orange in the dimming light. Old man Taylor looked up as Gray entered, his weathered face creasing in a frown. Need something, stranger? Tools, Gray said. To cut some chains. Taylor's bushy eyebrows rose. You talking about that Indian woman? Sheriff won't like that. Sheriff and I already had words on the matter. I ain't asking you to take sides, just to loan me what I need. The blacksmith studied him for a long moment, then sighed. Out back. You'll find what you need in the tool shed. I'm going to close up shop now and head home. Won't be back for at least an hour. Whatever happens while I'm gone, I don't know nothing about it. Gray nodded his thanks and slipped out the back door. In the tool shed, he found bolt cutters and a small saw. The bolt cutters would be quicker but noisier. The saw would take time but draw less attention. He chose the saw. When he returned to Dawee, the street was nearly empty, most folks having gone home for supper. She watched him without expression as he knelt beside her and began working on the chains. Why are you doing this? She asked softly. Gray kept sawing, the metal making a soft, grinding sound. Don't rightly know myself. You will be in trouble. Been in trouble before. Not like this, she warned. They hate my people. They will hate you too for helping me." Gray paused, looking up at her. In the fading light, her features were striking: high cheekbones, a strong jaw, those penetrating eyes. Despite her days without food or water, there was a regal quality to her bearing. "Where will you go?" he asked. "After?" She was silent for a moment. "My people are scattered. Some fled to the mountains. Others were taken to reservations. I do not know if any of my family still lives." The chain gave way with a soft snap. Gray moved to the next link. "You speak English well." "My father traded with whites. He believed it was important to understand their language." Her voice hardened slightly. "It did not save him when they came for our land." Gray didn't know what to say to that, so he kept working. The second chain broke more easily than the first. He helped her to her feet, steadying her when she swayed from weakness. Standing at her full height, Dawee towered over him by nearly a foot. Gray wasn't a short man at 6 feet even, but she made him feel small. Not in a threatening way, but in a way that made him acutely aware of her presence, her physicality. "Can you walk?" he asked. She nodded, rubbing her wrists where the chains had chafed them raw. "Where do we go?" Gray hadn't thought that far ahead. His room at the Silver Spur was too public, and besides, the bed would be far too small for her. The livery stable was an option, but only a temporary one. "First, we need to get you somewhere safe for the night," he said. "Then food and water. After that, we'll figure things out." The sound of approaching footsteps made them both tense. Gray's hand moved to his gun, but he relaxed when he saw it was just Mrs. Peterson, the widow who ran the town's small restaurant. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said, her voice hushed. "I saw what happened earlier. You and your friend should come with me." Gray hesitated, suspicious of the unexpected offer. "It's all right," Mrs. Peterson continued, noticing his reluctance. "My late husband was a doctor. He treated everyone who needed help, white or Indian. I've got a room behind the restaurant where your friend can rest. No one will look for her there." After a moment's consideration, Gray nodded. "Thank you, madam. That's mighty kind." "It's not kindness," she replied, her expression grim. "It's decency, something this town seems to have forgotten." They followed the widow through back alleys to avoid the main street, finally slipping through the rear entrance of the restaurant. The room she led them to was small but clean, with a bed that, while not large enough for Dawee to stretch out fully, would at least be more comfortable than the hard ground. "I'll bring some food," Mrs. Peterson said, "and water for washing." When she was gone, Dawee sank onto the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. Gray stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of his place now that they were safely hidden away. "You should go," Dawee said suddenly. "You have done enough, more than anyone would expect." Gray shook his head. "Sheriff's expecting me to take responsibility for you. Can't do that if I leave." "You do not know me," she pointed out. "I could be everything they say. A killer, a witch. Are you?" he asked simply. For the first time, a genuine smile crossed her face, transforming her features. "No, I am just a woman. Very tall, yes, but just a woman." Mrs. Peterson returned with a tray laden with food, a thick beef stew, fresh bread, and a pot of coffee along with a basin of water and clean cloths. She set everything down on a small table. "Eat slowly," she advised Dawee. "Your stomach will not be used to food after so many days without." Dawee nodded her thanks, but waited until the widow had left before reaching for the stew. Gray noticed that despite her obvious hunger, she ate with dignity and restraint, taking small, careful bites. "Tell me about your people," he said, taking a seat in the room's only chair. "I've met Apache before, but never anyone from your clan." "Band," she corrected. "Kairikahua Apache." "My father was a chief, but not a great one, just the leader of a small band. We lived in the mountains to the south." "And your husband?" A shadow crossed her face. He was Mescalero Apache, a scout. For a time he worked with the White Army, helping them find safe paths through the desert. Her hand stilled. Then they no longer needed scouts, they needed land instead. Gray nodded, understanding. It was a story he'd heard before in variations across the territories. Promises made, promises broken, land taken, people displaced or killed. "And your child?" he asked softly. Dawee's eyes glistened, but no tears fell. A son, 4 summers old, he had his father's smile. They sat in silence as she finished her meal. When she was done, Gray stood. "I should let you rest. I'll be right outside if you need anything." "Wait," she said as he reached for the door. "You have not told me your story. Why are you here in this place?" Gray paused, considering the question. "No story to tell, I'm just passing through like always." "No home, no family," he shrugged. "Left home a long time ago, family's all gone now." "So you wander," she observed. "Like the wind." "Something like that," Dawee nodded, as if confirming something to herself. "The wind can change direction when it wishes. It is not bound to one path." Gray wasn't sure what to make of that. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Ahtone. We'll figure out our next steps in the morning." He spent the night in a chair outside her door, dozing fitfully, one hand never far from his gun. The restaurant was quiet, Mrs. Peterson having closed early, claiming a headache to the few customers who'd arrived for supper. Gray was grateful for her discretion, though he wondered what would happen when the sheriff inevitably came looking for them. Morning arrived with the sound of birdsong and the smell of coffee brewing. Gray stretched, his back stiff from the uncomfortable night, and got to his feet just as Mrs. Peterson appeared with a tray. "Breakfast," she announced, "for both of you. And I've packed some supplies, food, water, a blanket. There's a trail behind the restaurant that leads to the creek. Follow it east and you'll reach the foothills by nightfall." Gray accepted the tray, surprised by her thoroughness. "You seem mighty prepared to help fugitives, Mrs. Peterson." The widow's face hardened. "My husband didn't just treat Indians, Mr. Zimmerman. He helped runaway slaves during the war. We had a hidden room in our house back in Missouri. I learned to be prepared." With a nod of respect, Gray carried the breakfast tray into the room. Dawee was already awake, sitting on the edge of the bed, her long legs stretched out before her. She'd used the basin to wash and had re-braided her hair, which hung in a thick plait down her back. "Morning," he said, setting down the tray. "Mrs. Peterson's provided breakfast and supplies. Seems she's eager to see us on our way." Dawee accepted a cup of coffee, holding it carefully in her large hands. "Where will we go?" Gray hadn't given it much thought, focused as he'd been on the immediate problem of getting her to safety. "Depends. What do you want to do? Find your people, if they still live," she said softly. "The last I heard, many were being taken to the San Carlos reservation. But that is not a place of life. It is a place of slow death." Gray had heard stories about the reservation's barren land, insufficient food, disease, no place for anyone to call home. "We could head to Colorado Territory. I know some folks there who might give us work, no questions asked." "Us?" She raised an eyebrow. "You would stay with me?" Gray shrugged, suddenly uncomfortable under her direct gaze. "Told the sheriff I'd take responsibility for you. A man's word should mean something." A small smile touched her lips. "Your word. Yes, this is important to you." "It's all I've got," he admitted. "That and the clothes on my back." They ate in companionable silence, Gray marveling at how comfortable it felt. He'd spent so many years avoiding connections, keeping to himself. Yet here he was, sharing breakfast with an Apache widow, planning a future that included both of them. It made no sense, and yet it felt more right than anything had in a long time. Their quiet moment was shattered by the sound of shouting from the front of the restaurant. Gray was on his feet in an instant, gun drawn. "Stay here," he told Dawee, moving to the door, "and be ready to run if things go bad." He slipped into the hallway, closing the door behind him. From his position, he could hear Mrs. Peterson's voice, high and indignant. "I've told you, Sheriff, I haven't seen anyone matching that description. Now, if you don't mind, I have bread in the oven that's about to burn. We'll just have a look around if it's all the same to you." That was Sheriff Boone's voice, smug with authority. "Got reports that the Apache woman was seen near here last night, and that stranger who helped her, he's wanted for questioning too." Gray retreated to Dawee's room. "Sheriff's here with deputies," he whispered. "We need to go, now." Dawee was already on her feet, gathering the supplies Mrs. Peterson had provided. "There is a window," she said, nodding to the small opening at the back of the room. Gray assessed it dubiously. It would be a tight fit for him, and he wasn't sure Dawee could squeeze through at all given her size, but they had no choice. The sound of boots in the hallway was growing closer. "You first," he told her, moving to the window and working the latch. It opened with a creak that seemed deafeningly loud in the quiet room. To his surprise, Dawee moved with silent grace despite her height. She folded her large frame into a compact crouch, angled her shoulders, and slipped through the window with remarkable agility. Gray followed, less elegantly but just as determined, tumbling into the dirt outside just as the door to the room burst open behind them. "They're running," came a shout from inside. "Out the back!" Gray scrambled to his feet, grabbed Dawee's hand, and pulled her toward the trail Mrs. Peterson had mentioned. They ran, crashing through underbrush, the sound of pursuit close behind them. The creek appeared ahead, a silver ribbon cutting through the landscape. Gray splashed into it without hesitation, pulling Dawee with him. The water was shallow but swift, the rocky bottom slippery underfoot. "This way," he gasped, leading her upstream. "We'll lose them in the water." They waded through the creek for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the sounds of pursuit gradually fading behind them. When Gray was certain they'd lost their trackers, he helped Dawee climb out on the far bank, both of them soaked and shivering despite the warmth of the morning. "You okay?" he asked, scanning her for injuries. She nodded, wringing water from the hem of her dress. "Yes, but we cannot stay here. They will bring trackers." Gray knew she was right. Sheriff Boone struck him as the type who wouldn't give up easily, especially now that his authority had been challenged publicly. "We need horses," he said, "and supplies, more than what Mrs. Peterson gave us." "There is a ranch," Dawee said, surprising him. 2 hours' walk from here." "The man who owns it, Green, he traded fairly with my people before the troubles began." Gray hesitated. "You're sure he can be trusted?" "No," she admitted, "but we have few choices." She was right about that. They were on foot with minimal supplies, being hunted by men with horses and guns. Not good odds by any measure. "Lead the way," he decided. They set off eastward, keeping to the shelter of the trees that lined the creek. As they walked, Gray found himself watching Dawee with growing fascination. Despite her size, she moved with a fluid grace, her steps silent on the forest floor. She seemed to know which plants were safe to touch and which to avoid, pointing out a cluster of berries for them to gather as they passed. "You know this area well," he observed as they paused to rest. She nodded. "My people hunted here for generations. Every stone, every tree has meaning. Must be hard," he ventured, seeing it change, seeing new people come. Dawee was quiet for a moment, her face unreadable. "The land remains," she said finally. "It remembers even when people forget." Gray wasn't sure he understood, but he nodded anyway, respecting the depth of her connection to this place. As the sun climbed higher, the day grew hotter, and their wet clothes became uncomfortable rather than cooling. They stopped by a small pool formed by a bend in the creek. Dawee suggesting they should dry their garments before continuing. "You first," Gray said, turning his back to give her privacy. "I'll keep watch." He could hear the rustle of fabric as she removed her dress, then the splash of water as she took the opportunity to bathe. It was an intimate sound in the quiet of the forest, and Gray found himself acutely aware of her presence behind him, her vulnerability. "It is safe now," she called after a few minutes. "Your turn." Gray turned to find her seated on a rock, her dress spread on nearby bushes to dry, wearing only a light cotton shift that she must have been wearing underneath. Despite the relative modesty of the garment, it revealed the powerful lines of her arms and shoulders, the curve of her waist. She was a striking woman, not just because of her height, but because of the strength and dignity she carried. Clearing his throat, Gray quickly bathed and washed his shirt, leaving his trousers on despite their dampness for the sake of decency. As he hung his shirt to dry, he caught Dawee watching him, her dark eyes thoughtful. "What?" he asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You have many scars," she observed. Gray glanced down at his torso, marked with the evidence of a hard life, a knife wound from a bar fight in Dodge City, a bullet graze from a stagecoach robbery he'd had the misfortune to witness, various scrapes and burns from years of odd jobs. "Occupational hazards," he shrugged. "Yet none from war," she noted. "Most white men your age fought in the Great Conflict, North or South." Gray looked away, uncomfortable with her perception. "I told you I keep moving." "Running," she corrected gently. "There is a difference." Before Gray could respond, a twig snapped nearby. Both of them froze, listening intently. The forest had gone quiet, no birdsong, no rustling of small animals. Something or someone was approaching. Silently, Gray reached for his gun while Dawee gathered her still damp dress. They retreated into the shadow of a large boulder, Gray positioning himself in front of her, despite knowing she was perfectly capable of defending herself. The brush parted, and a figure emerged, not one of the sheriff's men, but an old Apache man, his face weathered by sun and time. He stopped when he saw them, his eyes widening at the sight of Dawee. Words flowed from him in the Apache language, too fast for Gray to catch even if he'd understood it. Dawee responded, her voice filled with emotion. The old man stepped forward, reaching out to touch her face as if confirming she was real. "This is Nantai," she told Gray, "an elder of my band. He says our people are hiding in the mountains to the east. Some escaped the soldiers, including my mother and sisters." Relief washed over her features, making her look younger, less burdened. "He was hunting when he saw our tracks. He thought at first I was a spirit returning from the dead." The old man's eyes shifted to Gray, assessing. He said something else to Dawee, who seemed to hesitate before responding. "What did he say?" Gray asked. "He wants to know if you are my new husband," she translated, a flush rising to her cheeks. "In our way, if a woman's husband is killed, his closest friend or brother often marries her to protect her and her children." Gray felt his own face grow warm. "And what did you tell him? That you are a friend, a good man who helped me when others would not." Nantai spoke again, gesturing to the forest around them. "He says the sheriff's men are searching with dogs," Dawee explained. "We must hurry, he will take us to our people." Gray hesitated. This changed things. Dawee had found her people, she would be safe with them, protected. His responsibility was over. He could move on as he always did. Yet the thought brought no relief, only a hollow feeling in his chest. "You should go with him," he said, forcing the words out. "Your family is waiting." Dawee studied him, her eyes searching his face. "And you?" Gray shrugged, aiming for nonchalance. "I'll head north, like I planned." "Alone," she said. "It wasn't a question. It's better that way." He managed a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm not much for company." Dawee spoke to Nantai in their language. The old man looked at Gray, then back at her, before nodding slowly. He said something else, then turned and melted back into the forest. "He will wait for us," Dawee explained. "A short distance ahead. He understands we need to talk." Gray shifted uncomfortably. "Ain't nothing to talk about. You found your people. That's good. That's what you wanted." "Is it so easy for you?" she asked, her voice soft but intense. "To help someone to save their life and then walk away as if it meant nothing?" "I didn't say it meant nothing," Gray protested. "But your path leads one way, mine another." "Paths can change," she reminded him. "Like the wind." Gray looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "Your people wouldn't want me around." "I'm one of them, the ones who took your land, killed your husband, your son." "You are not them," Dawee said firmly. "Just as I am not every Apache who ever raised a weapon against whites." "It's not that simple." "No," she agreed. "It is not simple, but it is true." She stepped closer, her height making her impossible to ignore. 3 days ago, I was ready to die. I had lost everything: my husband, my child, my home. I had no reason to live. Then you came with bread, with kindness. You reminded me that goodness can come from unexpected places." Gray swallowed hard, something in his chest tightening at her words. "I'm not good," he said hoarsely. "I'm a coward, always have been, running from the war, from responsibility, from anything that might matter." "Yet you stood against the sheriff for me," she pointed out. Was that the action of a coward? Gray had no answer for that. Dawee reached out, her large hand gentle as she touched his face. "Come with me," she said simply. "Meet my people. After that, if you still wish to go your own way, I will not stop you." Gray knew he should refuse. The sensible thing would be to part ways now, to continue the solitary existence he'd carved out for himself. It would be safer, simpler. But looking into Dawee's eyes, he couldn't form the words of refusal. Instead, he found himself nodding. "All right," he said. "Lead the way." They retrieved their clothes, now mostly dry, and followed Nantai's trail through the forest. As they walked, Gray found himself matching his stride to Dawee's, falling into a rhythm beside her that felt surprisingly natural. The old Apache led them higher into the hills, along paths that were barely visible to Gray's untrained eye. By late afternoon, they had climbed to a vantage point that offered a view of the valley below, including the distant buildings of San Andreas. "Sheriff's men are spreading out," Gray observed, spotting small groups of riders combing the lower foothills. "They're not giving up easily." Nantai spoke, pointing to a rocky outcropping ahead. "He says we will be safe once we cross those rocks," Dawee translated. "The spirits protect that place. White men fear it." Gray was skeptical of spirits, but he'd known enough frontiersmen who were superstitious about certain landmarks to believe that some places might be avoided by searchers. They pressed on, the terrain growing steeper and more challenging. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the land, they reached a hidden valley nestled between two steep ridges. Smoke rose from several small fires, and as they descended into the valley, Gray saw a temporary camp of perhaps 30 Apache, mostly women, children, and elders. Their arrival caused an immediate stir. Women rushed forward, surrounding Dawee, touching her face and hands as if to confirm she was real. Children peeked out from behind their mothers, eyes wide at the sight of the towering woman returned from the dead. And at the sight of Gray, standing awkwardly at the edge of the reunion, an older woman pushed through the crowd, her face lined with age but her back still straight. When she saw Dawee, she let out a cry that needed no translation, the sound of a mother who had thought her child lost forever. They embraced, the older woman barely reaching Dawee's chest, but holding her with fierce strength. Words flowed between them in Apache, too fast and emotional for Gray to follow even if he'd understood the language. He stood apart, watching the reunion, feeling both privileged to witness it and acutely aware of his outsider status. These people had lost so much: their homes, their way of life, many of their loved ones because of men who looked like him. A small hand tugged at his sleeve. Gray looked down to find a young Apache girl, no more than 6 or 7, staring up at him with solemn eyes. She said something in her language, then switched to halting English. "You bring tall woman back," Gray nodded, kneeling to her level. "Yes, she's my friend." The girl considered this, then reached into a small pouch at her waist. She pulled out a polished stone, its surface smooth and glinting with flecks of quartz, and placed it in his palm. "For you," she said. "Good medicine." Before Gray could thank her, she darted away, disappearing into the gathering. He stood, the stone warm in his hand, and found Dawee watching him. She'd separated from the group and was approaching, her mother at her side. "Gray," she said, "this is my mother, Nayland. Mother, this is Gray Zimmerman, the man who saved my life." The older woman studied him with sharp eyes, then spoke rapidly to Dawee. "She asks why you helped me," Dawee translated. "When other white men wanted me dead." Gray thought about it, still not entirely sure of the answer himself. Tell her. Tell her sometimes a man has to decide what kind of person he wants to be. And that day, I decided I wanted to be someone who helps, not hurts." When Dawee translated, her mother's expression softened slightly. She reached out, taking Gray's hand in both of hers, and spoke again. "She says you are welcome among us," Dawee told him. "That any man who would risk his life for her daughter is a friend to our family." Gray felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a tension he hadn't fully acknowledged until it was gone. "Thank her for me, and tell her I'm honored." As night fell, the Apache built up their fires, careful to keep them small and smokeless to avoid detection. Food was shared, a stew of rabbit and wild greens that was surprisingly flavorful despite its simplicity. Gray sat with Dawee and her family, including her 2 younger sisters, who regarded him with curious but not unfriendly eyes. After the meal, the elders gathered to discuss their situation. Though Gray couldn't understand the words, the gravity of their conversation was clear from their expressions and gestures. When Nantai pointed in the direction of San Andreas, several voices rose in agitation. "What's happening?" Gray asked Dawee quietly. "They are debating what to do," she explained. "The soldiers are searching the mountains. It is not safe to stay here much longer. Some want to try to reach the White Mountain Apache territory to the north. Others think we should surrender and go to the reservation, where at least there would be food for the children." "Neither option sounds good," Gray observed. "No," she agreed, "but these are the choices left to us." The discussion continued late into the night with no clear resolution. Eventually, people began to drift to their sleeping areas, leaving the matter to be resolved in the morning. Dawee showed Gray to a small shelter of branches and hides where he could sleep. "You will be safe here," she assured him. "My cousins will keep watch through the night." Gray nodded his thanks, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. The past 2 days had been more eventful than the previous 2 years of his wandering life. "Where will you sleep?" "With my mother and sisters," she said, gesturing to a larger shelter nearby. "It has been many moons since we were together. We have much to talk about." "Of course." Gray hesitated, then added, "Dawee, thank you for bringing me here, for trusting me." She smiled, the firelight catching the angles of her face. "Rest now, Gray Zimmerman. Tomorrow will bring new decisions." As she turned to go, Gray found himself reaching for her hand. It was an impulsive gesture, one that surprised him as much as it seemed to surprise her. "I'm glad you're alive," he said simply. "I'm glad you found your family." Dawee looked down at their joined hands, his weather worn and relatively small in her larger one, then back at his face. "As am I," she replied softly. "Sleep well." Gray watched her go, her tall figure easily visible even in the darkness, before ducking into the shelter. Despite the hardness of the ground and the uncertainty of their situation, he fell asleep almost immediately, more at peace than he'd felt in years. He woke to the sound of urgent voices. Dawn was just breaking, the eastern sky lightening to a pale gray. Gray emerged from his shelter to find the camp in controlled chaos, people packing their meager belongings, mothers gathering children. Dawee hurried toward him, her face tense. "Scouts have spotted soldiers," she explained without preamble. "A full company moving up from the valley. They will be here by midday." Gray felt a chill despite the morning warmth. "How did they find the camp? We do not know. Perhaps they followed our trail. Perhaps someone from town guided them." She glanced at the activity around them. "We must leave quickly." "Where will you go?" Gray asked. Dawee's eyes met his, and he was struck by the determination in them. "North, to the territories where white men have not yet claimed every mountain and stream. It will be a hard journey, especially for the elders and children, but it is our only chance." Gray nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. These people would be forced to travel hundreds of miles through difficult terrain, hunted every step of the way. Many would not survive the journey. "I'll help," he said, the words coming without conscious thought. "I know the northern territories. I can guide you." Surprise flickered across Dawee's face, followed by something deeper, more complex. "You would do this? You said your path led elsewhere." "Paths change," he replied, echoing her words from the day before. "Besides, I gave the sheriff my word that I'd take responsibility for you. Can't do that if I leave." A smile touched her lips, briefly lighting her face despite the dire circumstances. "Then we are fortunate to have you with us, Gray Zimmerman." Within an hour, the camp was dismantled, leaving little evidence that anyone had been there. The Apache moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role in the sudden relocation. Gray found himself impressed by their resilience, their ability to adapt to a life of constant movement and danger. They set off just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains, traveling in single file along ridgelines and through ravines, avoiding open areas where they might be spotted from below. Dawee's mother, despite her age, moved with surprising agility, keeping pace with the younger members of the band. The children, even the smallest, made no complaints about the difficult terrain or the rapid pace. Gray took position near the rear of the group, helping an elderly man who struggled with the steeper sections of the path. As they walked, the old man, who introduced himself as Taza, shared stories of the land they were crossing, tales of ancestors who had hunted these mountains for generations, of battles fought against rival tribes long before the white settlers arrived. "You speak good English," Gray observed during a brief rest. Taza nodded. "I was a scout for the army many years ago, before they broke their promises." "Seems to be a pattern," Gray said grimly. "Yes," the old man agreed, "but not all white men are the same, just as not all Apache are the same. Dawee sees this in you. That is why she trusts you." Gray glanced ahead to where Dawee walked with her mother, her height making her easily visible among the group. "She's an extraordinary woman." "She has always been different," Taza said. "Not just her size, which is a gift from the spirits, but her heart. She sees beyond what others see." Before Gray could respond, a warning call came from one of the scouts at the front of the line. Everyone froze, then quickly moved off the trail into the shelter of rocks and trees. Gray helped Taza into a crevice between two boulders, then found his own hiding place, a thicket of scrub oak that offered concealment. From his position, he could see a patrol of cavalry soldiers on the ridge below them, perhaps a quarter-mile away. 6 men on horseback, moving slowly, scanning the slopes above them. They hadn't spotted the Apache group yet, but they were methodically searching the area. Gray felt for his revolver, though he knew using it would only bring more soldiers down on them. Besides, he'd spent a lifetime avoiding such confrontations. Yet here he was, preparing to defend these people if necessary. The soldiers continued along the ridge, their blue uniforms distinct against the brown and green landscape. For a tense few minutes, it seemed they might turn up the slope toward the hidden Apache. But then the patrol leader signaled, and they changed direction, moving away toward the next valley. A collective sigh of relief ran through the hidden group. They emerged from their concealment and continued their journey, moving more cautiously now, aware that soldiers were nearby. By nightfall, they had covered nearly 15 miles of difficult mountain terrain. They made camp in a secluded box canyon, with scouts posted at its narrow entrance. Food was scarce, a few rabbits caught along the way, some wild onions and greens. It was divided equally, with the children and elders eating first. Gray sat with Dawee and her family, sharing what remained of the supplies Mrs. Peterson had given them. The bread was stale now, but no one complained. In the quiet of the evening, with the first stars appearing overhead, there was an almost peaceful quality to the gathering, despite the circumstances that had forced them here. "How far to safer territory?" Gray asked as they finished their meager meal. "Many days' journey," Dawee replied. "Perhaps 2 weeks if we can maintain this pace and avoid the soldiers." Gray nodded, calculating. "Food will be the biggest challenge, and water once we leave the mountains." "We know how to find what we need," Dawee assured him. "Our people have survived in these lands since before time was counted." "Still," Gray said, "it won't be easy, especially with winter coming." Dawee's eyes met his across the small fire. "Are you regretting your decision to join us?" "No," he said without hesitation, "just being practical." A smile touched her lips. "Practical is good. We will need practical thinking." She glanced around at the gathered Apache. "And hope." Later, as the camp settled for the night, Gray found a spot at the edge of the canyon where he could look up at the vast expanse of stars. He'd always appreciated the clarity of the night sky in the territories, far from the smoke and lights of cities. It reminded him of his boyhood in Pennsylvania, lying in fields and dreaming of adventures in the West. The reality had been far different from those dreams, harsher, lonelier, more morally complex. He'd seen the best and worst of humanity in his years of wandering, but he'd kept himself apart from it all, an observer rather than a participant in the great dramas unfolding across the frontier. Until now. Until Dawee. The sound of soft footsteps interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find her approaching, her silhouette unmistakable even in the darkness. "May I join you?" she asked. Gray nodded, moving over to make room on the rock where he sat. Despite her height, Dawee settled beside him with graceful ease, folding her long legs beneath her. For a time, they sat in comfortable silence, looking up at the stars. Then Dawee spoke, her voice soft in the quiet night. "When I was a child, my father told me that the stars are the campfires of our ancestors, that they watch over us from above." Gray considered this. "That's a nice thought. Do your people have stories about the stars?" He thought back to his childhood, to his mother's voice on summer nights. "My ma used to point out the constellations' patterns of stars, said they were pictures in the sky. That one there," he pointed, "is the Big Dipper. And there's the North Star, which always shows the way home." "The way home," Dawee repeated thoughtfully. "I wonder where home will be for my people now." Gray had no answer for that. The reality of the Apache situation was stark. Their traditional lands were being systematically taken, their way of life destroyed. The future held few good options. "I never really had a home," he found himself saying. "Not since I left Pennsylvania. Just kept moving, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots." "Why?" she asked simply. Gray shrugged, uncomfortable with the directness of her question. "Just seemed easier that way. No attachments, no expectations, no one counting on me." "No one to disappoint," Dawee suggested perceptively. He looked at her, surprised by her insight. "Maybe." "It is a lonely way to live," she observed. "Sometimes," he acknowledged, "but it's simpler. Simpler is not always better." Dawee turned to face him more directly, her expression serious in the starlight. "Gray Zimmerman, why did you really choose to help me that day? The truth." Gray was silent for a long moment, searching for an answer that felt honest. "I don't rightly know," he finally admitted. "Something about seeing you there, so proud even in chains. It just felt wrong, and for once I couldn't walk away. And now, why stay with us when you could return to your wandering life?" He met her gaze. "Because for the first time in years, what I'm doing feels right. Helping you, helping your people, it matters. And I'm tired of nothing mattering." Dawee nodded, as if his answer confirmed something she'd already suspected. "Among my people, there is a belief that each person has a path set by the Creator, but sometimes we wander from that path. We become lost. Perhaps you have found your true path again. Or perhaps I'm just a fool rushing into trouble after years of avoiding it," Gray said with a wry smile. Dawee laughed softly, the sound warm in the cool night air. "Perhaps both are true." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of one of the scouts, a young man named Chato. He spoke urgently to Dawee in Apache, gesturing toward the canyon entrance. "What is it?" Gray asked as the scout hurried away. "Soldiers," Dawee said grimly. "A larger group this time, camped in the valley below. They have set up a perimeter. Chato believes they know we are nearby." Gray's mind raced through options. "We could try to slip past them in the darkness." "Too risky with the children and elders," Dawee shook her head. "And they have dogs. They would catch our scent." "Then we need a diversion," Gray decided. "Something to draw them away from your people's escape route." Understanding dawned in Dawee's eyes. "You mean for us to create this diversion?" "Not us," Gray corrected. "Me. I'll lead them on a chase while the rest of you head north." "No." Her refusal was immediate and firm. "It is too dangerous. They will kill you if they catch you." "They'll have to catch me first," Gray said with more confidence than he felt. "I know these mountains almost as well as your people do. I can keep them busy for a day or two, then circle back and rejoin you farther north." Dawee studied him, her expression troubled. "Why would you risk this for us?" Gray hesitated, then reached for her hand. It was a bold move, more intimate than their previous interactions, but it felt right. "You know why," he said softly. Her fingers tightened around his, her eyes never leaving his face. "Yes," she acknowledged. "I believe I do." They sat like that for a moment, connected, the unspoken growing between them. Then Dawee sighed and released his hand. "We will discuss this with the elders," she said. "There may be another way." But the Council of Elders, hastily convened in the pre-dawn darkness, saw the wisdom in Gray's plan. With the soldiers establishing a perimeter in the valley below, the chances of moving the entire group, including children, pregnant women, and elders, without detection were slim. "I will go with him," Dawee announced, surprising Gray and the council alike. "Two riders will create a more convincing diversion than one." Her mother protested vigorously, but Dawee was firm. "I am the one they want most," she pointed out. "The giant Apache witch who killed soldiers. If they see me, they will focus all their efforts on my capture." Gray wanted to argue, to insist she stay with her people, but he recognized the logic of her position. Besides, a part of him, a selfish part he wasn't proud of, was glad she would be with him. The plan was quickly formalized. Gray and Dawee would take the group's two strongest horses and create a visible trail heading east at first light. They would allow themselves to be spotted by the soldiers, leading them on a chase away from the main group, who would continue north through a hidden pass that the cavalry might not know existed. They would rendezvous 3 days later at a landmark Dawee called Three Brothers, a formation of 3 distinctive peaks visible for miles around. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, final preparations were made. Gray checked and rechecked his revolver, while Dawee gathered supplies for their journey: food, water, extra ammunition. Her mother approached as they were preparing the horses, her face lined with worry. She spoke to Dawee in Apache, her words flowing too rapidly for Gray to catch, even if he'd understood the language. Dawee replied, then embraced her mother, the older woman looking tiny against her daughter's tall frame. Then, to Gray's surprise, Nayland turned to him. She took his hands in hers and spoke, her eyes boring into his with an intensity that needed no translation. "She asks you to protect her daughter," Dawee translated, her voice thick with emotion, "and to return safely yourself. She says you are now part of our family's story." Gray swallowed hard, touched by the acceptance in the older woman's eyes. "Tell her I give her my word. We will find you at Three Brothers, no matter what." With final embraces and murmured blessings, they parted ways. The Apache band would wait in the canyon until Gray and Dawee had successfully drawn off the soldiers, then make their escape through the northern pass. As they rode out of the canyon, the rising sun at their backs, Gray felt a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. For a man who had spent his life avoiding conflict, he was now riding deliberately toward it. For a man who had avoided connections, he now found himself tied to these people, to Dawee, in ways he couldn't fully articulate. "Ready?" he asked, glancing at her. Dawee, mounted on a paint mare that seemed small beneath her tall frame, nodded. Her face was composed, resolute. "Yes, let us give these soldiers something to remember." They rode east along the ridgeline, making no effort to hide their trail, deliberately breaking branches and disturbing rocks to ensure they would be easy to follow. After about an hour, they reached a vantage point that offered a clear view of the valley below. The cavalry camp was visible, blue uniformed men moving about, preparing for the day's search. "Time to be seen," Gray said, taking a deep breath. They moved to a more exposed position, and Dawee fired a shot into the air. The sharp crack echoed across the valley, causing immediate activity in the camp below. Soldiers scrambled for weapons, horses were quickly saddled. "That got their attention," Gray observed dryly. They waited until they were certain they'd been spotted, a soldier pointing up at them. Others gathering to look then turned their horses and rode along the ridge, clearly visible against the skyline. "Now we run," Dawee said, urging her horse to a gallop. They rode hard, following a route they discussed with the Apache scouts, one that would lead the soldiers on a long chase through difficult terrain, away from the northern pass that the main group would use. It was a dangerous game, staying just far enough ahead to keep the soldiers following, but not so far that they would give up the chase. By midday, they could hear the pursuit behind them, the distant sound of hooves on rocky ground, occasional shouts as the soldiers communicated with each other. They paused at a stream to water their horses and catch their breath. "They're staying with us," Gray noted, glancing back the way they'd come, "but not gaining much ground." "They will not give up easily," Dawee said, "not with the reward the army has offered for my capture." Gray looked at her sharply, Reward? You didn't mention that, she shrugged. $500 for the giant Apache woman who killed 3 soldiers, dead or alive. That's a lot of money, Gray said grimly. No wonder the sheriff was so determined. Yes. It would be a year's wages for most men. Dawee's expression was somber. I am sorry to bring this danger to you. Gray shook his head. Don't apologize, I chose this path. He managed a smile. Besides, I've never been worth that much money before. It's almost flattering. Her answering smile warmed him more than the midday sun. You are worth far more, Gray Zimmerman. They continued east through the afternoon, pushing their horses as much as they dared while being careful not to exhaust them. The soldiers remained in pursuit, sometimes visible in the distance when the trail opened up, but never close enough to be an immediate threat. As dusk approached, they found a sheltered ravine where they could rest for the night. The narrow entrance was easily defensible, and a small spring provided water for them and their horses. They built no fire, sharing cold jerky and dried fruit as they kept watch in turns. Gray took the first watch, positioned at the ravine's entrance where he could see anyone approaching. The night was quiet except for the occasional cry of a hunting owl or the distant howl of a coyote. The soldiers, he guessed, had made camp for the night, unwilling to risk the treacherous mountain terrain in darkness. Halfway through his watch, Dawee joined him. She moved silently despite her size, settling beside him without disturbing a single stone. You should be resting, he said softly. Your watch isn't for hours yet. I could not sleep, she admitted. Too many thoughts. Gray nodded, understanding. Worried about your people? Yes. And about tomorrow, about what lies ahead for all of us. She pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders against the night chill. This life of running cannot continue forever. No, Gray agreed. Something will have to change. But what? She looked at him, her face barely visible in the starlight. The reservations are places of death. Continuing to hide in the mountains means hunger and cold, especially for the children. There seems to be no place left for my people in this world. Gray had no easy answers. The reality of the situation was stark. The Apache way of life was being systematically destroyed, their lands taken, their people killed or confined to reservations where disease and starvation awaited them. It was a tragedy playing out across the West, with different tribes but the same ending. I don't know, he admitted honestly, but I do know that giving up isn't an option, not for you, not for your people. Dawee was silent for a moment, considering his words. When I was chained outside the sheriff's office, she said finally, I had given up. I was ready to die, to join my husband and son in the spirit world. Then you came with bread and kindness. You reminded me that life still has value, even in darkness. Gray felt a tightness in his chest at her words. I'm glad, he said simply. She turned to face him more directly. Gray Zimmerman, when we reach 3 brothers and rejoin my people, what will you do? The question caught him off guard, though it was one he'd been avoiding asking himself. I'm not sure, he admitted. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Will you continue north with us? Or return to your wandering life? Gray knew what the sensible answer should be. He should help them reach safety, then move on, as he always had. Attaching himself to a band of fugitive Apache would bring nothing but hardship and danger. Yet the thought of leaving Dawee, of returning to his solitary existence, filled him with a hollowness he couldn't ignore. If you'll have me, he said quietly, I'd like to stay, at least for a while. In the darkness, he felt rather than saw her smile. I would like that very much, she replied, her voice soft but certain. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars wheel overhead until it was time for Dawee's watch. Gray returned to their small camp and wrapped himself in his blanket, but sleep was slow to come. His mind was filled with thoughts of the future, a future that, for the first time in years, he found himself actively wanting to be part of, rather than simply drifting through. Morning brought a renewal of their chase game with the soldiers. They allowed themselves to be glimpsed just long enough to ensure the pursuit continued, then used their knowledge of the terrain to stay ahead. By midday, they had led the cavalry several miles east of the northern pass that their people would be using. "I think we've drawn them far enough," Gray said as they paused to water their horses at a small creek. "We should start heading north ourselves, take a roundabout route to Three Brothers." Dawee nodded in agreement. "There is a hidden trail through the next valley that could—" She stopped suddenly, her head tilting as she listened. Gray strained his ears but heard nothing unusual. "What is it?" "Horses," she said. "Coming from the north." Gray cursed under his breath. If cavalry was approaching from the north as well, they might be caught between the two groups. They quickly mounted and moved to higher ground, finding a position among some boulders that offered a view of the valley below. Gray pulled out a small spyglass he carried and scanned the northern approach. What he saw made his blood run cold. It wasn't cavalry approaching, but a group of about 10 men in civilian clothing, bounty hunters, most likely, drawn by the reward for Dawee's capture. And they were riding directly toward the path that would intersect with their own intended route. "Bounty hunters," he told Dawee grimly. "Heading this way." Her face tightened. "And the soldiers still behind us." "We're being boxed in," Gray realized. He studied the terrain, looking for options. "There's a canyon to the west. It's narrow, might be defensible if we have to make a stand." Dawee considered this. "There is another way," she said slowly. "A more difficult path, but one they might not know to watch." "Show me," Gray urged. They descended from their vantage point and rode west, keeping to the shelter of trees and rocks as much as possible. After about a mile, they reached what appeared to be a sheer cliff face. "Here," Dawee said, dismounting. "There is a path, hidden unless you know where to look." Gray was skeptical until she led him to a narrow fissure in the rock, barely visible unless you were standing right in front of it. It was just wide enough for a horse to navigate, though it would be a tight squeeze. "It leads up and over the ridge," Dawee explained. "My people have used it for generations to escape enemies." "The horses won't like it," Gray observed, "but it's better than facing those bounty hunters and soldiers." They led their mounts into the fissure, which opened slightly once they were past the initial narrow entrance. The path was steep and treacherous, requiring them to proceed on foot, leading the reluctant horses. At several points, the trail seemed to disappear entirely, only to resume after a difficult scramble over boulders or along ledges that made Gray's heart race. Dawee moved with surprising agility despite her height, finding handholds and footholds that Gray would have missed. She seemed to know the path intimately, never hesitating at junctions or when the way forward wasn't immediately obvious. "You've been this way before," Gray observed during a brief rest. She nodded. "As a child with my father, he showed me all the secret paths of our territory, saying that knowledge might save my life one day." A sad smile touched her lips. He was right. They continued their ascent, the horses struggling on the steeper sections but managing to follow. By late afternoon, they reached the top of the ridge, emerging onto a plateau that offered a spectacular view of the surrounding mountains. "There," Dawee said, pointing to a distinctive formation of 3 peaks in the distance. "Three Brothers. Our destination." Gray estimated it was at least a 2-day journey, possibly 3 depending on their pace and whether they needed to avoid more pursuers. "Let's hope your people made it safely." They made camp that night in a sheltered hollow, risking a small fire for warmth as the mountain air grew increasingly cold. Their supplies were running low, just enough jerky and dried fruit for one more day, Then they would need to hunt or forage. As they sat by the fire, sharing their meager meal, Gray found himself studying Dawee's profile, struck again by her remarkable presence. She was unlike any woman he'd ever known, not just physically, but in her strength of character, her quiet dignity in the face of hardship. "Tell me about your husband," he said suddenly, surprising himself with the question. Dawee looked up, equally surprised. "Why do you ask?" Gray shrugged. "Just curious about the man who won your heart." She was quiet for a moment, gazing into the fire. "His name was Nilchai," she finally said. "He was Mescalero Apache, from the mountains to the east. We met at a trading gathering when I was 17. He was not afraid of my size, as many men were. He said it made me like a warrior goddess from the old stories." A soft smile played on her lips at the memory. "He was kind and brave, and could make me laugh even when there was little to laugh about. When the troubles with the white soldiers grew worse, he believed we could find a way to live in peace. That is why he became a scout, to build understanding between our peoples." Her expression darkened. "But the army wanted land, not understanding. When they no longer needed scouts, they turned on those who had helped them. Nilchai was shot while trying to protect our son, Tarak." Gray felt a deep ache at the pain in her voice. "I'm sorry," he said inadequately. "They deserved better." "Yes," Dawee agreed, "as did so many others on all sides of this conflict." She looked at him directly. "What of you, Gray Zimmerman? Has there been love in your wandering life?" Gray poked at the fire, uncomfortable with the question. "Nothing that lasted," he admitted. "There was a girl in Pennsylvania before I left. Thought I might marry her someday. But then the war came and I ran, didn't look back." "You have never returned to your homeland," he shook his head. "Nothing to go back to. Parents died while I was out west. No siblings. The girl married someone else, someone who didn't run when the fighting started." "You are too hard on yourself," Dawee observed. "Many men fled that war. It was a terrible time." "Maybe," Gray acknowledged, "but I've been running ever since. Never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, to build something lasting." "Until now," she suggested quietly. Gray met her gaze across the fire. "Until now," he agreed. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Dawee broke the connection, rising to her feet. "We should rest," she said. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Gray nodded, though sleep seemed suddenly far away. As they settled into their respective blankets on opposite sides of the fire, he found himself thinking about paths not taken, choices made and avoided, and how a simple act of kindness, a loaf of bread shared with a starving woman, had somehow changed the entire course of his life. The next morning dawned clear and cold, frost sparkling on the ground around their campsite. They set off early, following a route that would keep them on high ground as much as possible, giving them visibility of the terrain ahead while making it harder for others to spot them. They saw no sign of pursuit throughout the morning, which Gray found both reassuring and slightly worrying. Had the soldiers and bounty hunters given up so easily? Or were they waiting somewhere ahead, anticipating the Apache band's likely route? By midday, they had made good progress toward Three Brothers, the distinctive peaks growing larger on the horizon. They paused at a small alpine lake to rest and water their horses. "We should reach the meeting place by tomorrow afternoon," Dawee said, scanning the surrounding landscape. "If all goes well." Gray nodded, though a sense of unease had been growing in him throughout the day. "Do you think your people made it safely?" "I hope so," she replied. "The northern pass is difficult to find unless you know it exists, and my cousins are skilled at moving without leaving trails." They continued their journey through the afternoon, the terrain gradually changing as they descended from the higher elevations. The sparse alpine vegetation gave way to pine forest, providing better cover but limiting visibility. As dusk approached, they found a small clearing beside a stream where they could camp for the night. With their food supplies nearly exhausted, Gray set a few snares while Dawee gathered edible plants that she recognized from the forest floor. Their combined efforts yielded a modest meal, one rabbit and an assortment of roots and greens. As they ate, Gray found himself marveling at how natural it felt, this partnership that had developed between them. They worked together without needing many words, each anticipating the other's needs and actions. "Tomorrow we will know if our plan succeeded," Dawee said as they finished their meal. "If my people reached the meeting place safely." Gray heard the worry in her voice. "They're resourceful," he reminded her, "and they had a good head start while we led the soldiers on a wild chase." She nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I fear for them, especially the children and elders. The journey is hard enough for those in their prime." "We've done all we can," Gray said gently. "Now we have to trust that it was enough." They slept in shifts that night, each taking turns to keep watch. During Gray's second watch, in the darkest hours before dawn, he heard something that made him freeze, the distant but unmistakable sound of a gunshot, followed by several more in rapid succession. He woke Dawee immediately. "Gunfire," he said grimly. "To the north." She was instantly alert, reaching for her weapon. How far? Hard to tell. Sound carries strangely in these mountains. Could be a mile, could be 5. They quickly packed their meager camp and saddled the horses, though they would have to wait for more light before attempting to navigate the forest. As the eastern sky began to lighten, they set off in the direction of the gunfire, moving as quietly as possible through the underbrush. After about an hour of cautious travel, they reached a ridgeline that offered a view of the valley below. What they saw made Gray's heart sink. In a clearing about half a mile away, a group of soldiers had surrounded what appeared to be several Apache, including women and children. Even from this distance, Gray could see that some of the Apache were lying motionless on the ground. "No," Dawee whispered, her voice tight with anguish. "My people." Gray pulled out his spyglass for a closer look. "It's not all of them," he reported, scanning the scene. "Maybe a dozen at most. Could be a smaller group that got separated from the main band." This offered little comfort to Dawee. "We must help them," she said, already checking her weapon. Gray assessed the situation with growing dread. There appeared to be at least 15 soldiers, well armed and in defensive positions around their Apache captives. The odds were overwhelmingly against them. "Dawee," he said gently, "we're outnumbered. Even if we managed to surprise them, we couldn't take on that many soldiers." "So we do nothing?" she demanded, her eyes flashing with anger and grief. "Watch as they kill my people or march them to a reservation to die slowly." Gray understood her pain, but he also knew a suicide mission when he saw one. "If we die trying to save them, who will help the rest of your band? Who will guide them north to safety?" This gave her pause. She looked again at the scene below, her face a mask of conflicting emotions. "There must be something we can do," she insisted. Gray thought rapidly, considering and discarding various plans. Then an idea began to form, not a good one, certainly not a safe one, but possibly their only option. "There is one thing we might try," he said slowly, "but it's risky and there's no guarantee it will work." "Tell me," Dawee urged. "The soldiers want you, the giant Apache witch. That's their primary target. If they see you, they might be distracted enough to give the captives a chance to escape." He met her gaze steadily. "I'll create a diversion from another direction. Between the two of us, we might draw enough attention to give your people an opening." Dawee considered the plan, her expression grave. "You are suggesting I allow myself to be seen to draw their fire." "Just long enough to create confusion," Gray emphasized. Then you disappear back into the forest. You're good at that, better than anyone I've ever seen." She nodded slowly. "It could work, but it is very dangerous." "It is," Gray agreed. He couldn't sugarcoat the risk. "But I don't see another way to help those people down there." After a moment's thought, Dawee reached a decision. "We will try." "But Gray," she fixed him with an intense look, "do not take unnecessary risks. If it goes badly, save yourself." He wanted to promise that he would, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he simply nodded and began outlining the details of their desperate plan. They separated, Gray circling around to approach the clearing from the west, while Dawee positioned herself to the east, where the terrain offered better cover for a quick escape. The timing would be critical. Gray would fire several shots to draw attention. Then Dawee would appear briefly on the ridgeline, visible enough to be recognized but far enough away to have a chance at escaping pursuit. Gray found a position behind a fallen tree that gave him a clear view of the soldiers while providing decent cover. From here, he could see the Apache captives more clearly, mostly women and children, with a few elderly men. None appeared to be seriously injured, though several had been bound. Taking a deep breath, he fired 3 quick shots into the air, then immediately shifted position to avoid return fire. The effect was immediate: soldiers scrambling for weapons, officers shouting commands, attention diverted from the captives. Then Dawee appeared on the opposite ridgeline, her tall figure unmistakable even at that distance. She stood fully exposed for just a moment, long enough to be seen, then vanished back into the trees. The reaction was everything they'd hoped for. "It's her, the Apache giantess!" One soldier shouted. "Over there!" Half the soldiers immediately began pursuing Dawee, breaking away from the captive group. The remaining soldiers were now spread thin, their attention divided between guarding their prisoners and watching for additional threats. Gray fired again, from his new position, creating the impression of multiple attackers. More confusion ensued, with soldiers firing wildly into the forest, unsure of what they were facing. In the chaos, Gray saw one of the Apache women, an older one who had been left unbound, subtly working to free the others. As soon as several were loose, they made their move, darting toward the forest on the south side of the clearing while their guards were distracted. Not all made it. Gray watched in horror as one soldier noticed the escape attempt and opened fire, cutting down an elderly man and a young woman. But the rest of the captives disappeared into the trees, using the cover of underbrush to mask their retreat. Gray fired a final shot, then began his own withdrawal, moving quickly but carefully through the forest. The plan had worked. At least partially. Some of the Apache had escaped, and the soldiers were now divided and disorganized. But he'd lost sight of Dawee, and the sound of gunfire continued from the direction where she'd been, fighting down his concern. He focused on reaching their predetermined meeting point. A distinctive lightning struck pine about a mile from the clearing. He arrived first and took cover, watching anxiously for any sign of Dawee or pursuit. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The distant sounds of the soldiers searching the forest gradually faded, suggesting they were moving away from his position. Still no sign of Dawee. Just as Gray was beginning to consider backtracking to look for her, he heard a soft rustle in the underbrush. He raised his gun, then lowered it immediately as Dawee emerged from between 2 dense fir trees. "You made it," he breathed, relief washing over him. She nodded, though he noticed she was moving with less than her usual grace. "Some of my people escaped," she said, her voice tight. "I saw them running south." "Yes, at least 6 or 7 got away," Gray confirmed. "The soldiers were completely confused by our little trick." Dawee leaned against a tree, and Gray suddenly realized something was wrong. Her left sleeve was dark with blood. "You're hit," he said, moving quickly to her side. "It is not serious," she assured him, though her face was pale beneath her copper skin. "The bullet only grazed my arm." Gray insisted on examining the wound. It was indeed a graze rather than a direct hit, but it was deep enough to need attention. He used their limited medical supplies to clean and bind it as best he could. "We need to keep moving," Dawee said as soon as he'd finished. "The soldiers will regroup and continue searching." "You should rest," Gray argued, concerned by her pallor. She shook her head firmly. "No time. We must reach Three Brothers, find the rest of my people." Knowing she was right, Gray helped her mount her horse. They set off at a more cautious pace than before, staying within the forest cover and stopping frequently to listen for pursuit. By nightfall, they had seen no further sign of soldiers, though they remained vigilant. They made a cold camp, not risking a fire that might give away their position. Dawee's wound had stopped bleeding, but Gray worried about infection. He'd seen too many men die from seemingly minor wounds that turned putrid. "Try to sleep," he told her as they huddled under their blankets. "I'll take first watch." Dawee, exhausted from blood loss and the day's exertions, didn't argue. She closed her eyes, her breathing soon settling into the rhythm of sleep. Gray watched over her, struck again by the strange turn his life had taken. A month ago, he'd been drifting aimlessly, answerable to no one, committed to nothing. Now he sat guard over an Apache woman for whom he would, he realized with some surprise, willingly risk his life. Somewhere along the way, without his noticing, she had become important to him. More than important, necessary, like air or water. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. Morning brought no sign of fever, much to Gray's relief. Dawee's wound looked clean, and some color had returned to her face. They ate the last of their provisions, a few strips of jerky and some dried berries, and continued their journey toward Three Brothers. By midday, the three distinctive peaks loomed close, their jagged profiles stark against the blue sky. The meeting place, Dawee explained, was a hidden valley on the north side of the central peak, where natural hot springs created a warm microclimate even in the colder months. As they approached, Gray noticed Dawee growing increasingly tense, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of her people or of danger. They proceeded with caution, aware that the meeting place might be watched by soldiers or bounty hunters if their original plan had failed. The entrance to the valley was so well concealed that Gray would have ridden past it if not for Dawee's guidance. A narrow gap between two massive boulders, partially obscured by a stand of aspens, led to a twisting path that descended into the hidden valley. As they emerged from the path, Gray was struck by the beauty of the place. The valley was small but lush, with steam rising from several pools of water scattered among rocky outcroppings. The warm, mineral-rich environment supported plant life that seemed out of place in the otherwise harsh mountain terrain. But what truly caught his attention was the absence of people. The valley appeared empty, showing no signs of recent occupation. "They're not here," Dawee said, dismounting and scanning the area with growing concern. "They should have arrived by now." Gray also dismounted, examining the ground for tracks or other evidence. "Maybe they're delayed, or perhaps they found the valley watched and chose another meeting place." Dawee shook her head. "They would have left a sign, something to tell us where they went." She moved through the valley, checking various locations with increasing urgency. "Something is wrong," Gray was inclined to agree. Given the encounter with soldiers the previous day, it was possible that the main Apache group had run into similar trouble. Or perhaps they had arrived safely, but had been discovered and forced to flee. As they searched the valley, Gray noticed something tucked into a crevice in one of the rock formations, a small bundle wrapped in buckskin. He called Dawee over, and she immediately recognized it as an Apache message bundle. With trembling hands, she unwrapped it, revealing a small piece of birch bark with symbols carved into its surface. Gray couldn't read the markings, but Dawee's expression told him the news wasn't good. "What does it say?" he asked quietly. "My mother's sign," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. "They were here 3 days ago, but they saw many soldiers in the mountains, moving in patterns that suggested they knew about this place." She traced one of the symbols with her finger. "They have gone to the Valley of Shadows, a place sacred to our people further north. It is a message only another Apache would understand." Gray nodded, relieved that her people had at least left a trail for them to follow. "How far is this Valley of Shadows?" 2 days' journey, perhaps 3 in our current state," Dawee answered. She looked up at him, her dark eyes troubled. "Gray, the valley is very remote, very difficult to access. It is one of the last places my people can go without fear of discovery, if we travel there together." She didn't finish the thought, but Gray understood. Once they reached this final sanctuary, there would be no easy way for him to return to the white world. He would be committing himself fully to life with the Apache, with all its hardships and uncertainties. "If you wish to part ways," Dawee continued, "I would understand. You have already done more than anyone could expect." Gray considered her words, though in truth, his decision had been made long before this moment. 2 days, you said?" he asked with a faint smile. "We'd better get started then." The relief and gratitude in Dawee's eyes made any doubts he might have had vanish like morning mist. She stepped closer, and for the first time, she initiated physical contact between them, placing her hand against his cheek in a gesture so tender it made his heart ache. "Thank you," she said simply. Gray covered her hand with his own. "No need for thanks. We're in this together now." They spent the night in the hidden valley, allowing themselves and their horses to rest and recover their strength for the journey ahead. The hot springs provided a chance to properly clean Dawee's wound, which was healing well, and to wash away the grime of days on the trail. As they sat beside one of the warm pools after a meal of fish Gray had managed to catch, a comfortable silence settled between them. The stars appeared one by one in the darkening sky, and a crescent moon hung above the western ridge. "Tell me about this Valley of Shadows," Gray said eventually. "Why is it sacred to your people?" Dawee gazed up at the stars, gathering her thoughts. "It is said that in the time of creation, when the world was still forming, the spirits carved a perfect valley hidden deep in the mountains. They filled it with all that was needed for life: water, plants, animals. Then they surrounded it with cliffs so sheer that only those guided by the spirits themselves could find the path in." She continued, her voice taking on the rhythm of a storyteller. "For generations, my people have used this valley as a place of refuge in times of great danger. It is said that no enemy has ever found it, that the spirits themselves hide it from those with ill intentions." Gray smiled at the legend, though he suspected the valley's protection had more to do with treacherous terrain than spiritual guardians. "And you know the way?" "My father showed me once when I was young." Dawee's expression grew serious. "But it is not an easy path, Gray. There are places where a single misstep means death." "Well," he said lightly, "I'll just have to be careful where I step." She smiled at his attempt at humor, but her eyes remained serious. "When we reach the valley, if my people are there, you will be the first white man many of them have ever seen who was not a soldier or a settler taking their land. They may not welcome you." "I understand," Gray said, and he did. He had no illusions about the reception he might receive. "I'll do my best not to give them reason to mistrust me. Most will follow my mother's lead." Dawee assured him, "and she has already accepted you as a friend to our family. But there may be some, especially among the warriors, who will see only your skin and not your heart." Gray nodded, knowing she spoke the truth. The hostility between whites and Apache ran deep, with atrocities committed on both sides. He couldn't expect decades of conflict to be forgotten simply because he had helped one woman. "We'll face that challenge when we come to it," he said. "For now, let's focus on finding your people." They set out at dawn the next morning, following a route that took them ever higher into the mountains. The terrain became increasingly difficult, the trails narrower and less defined. By midday, they were forced to leave their horses behind in a small meadow with good grass and water, continuing on foot through passages too treacherous for mounted travel. The path Dawee chose seemed, to Gray's eye, to lead nowhere up sheer rock faces, through narrow crevices, along ledges barely wide enough for a foothold. Yet she moved with confidence, occasionally pausing to study the landscape before choosing a direction. "My father said to look for signs that might not seem like signs," she explained when Gray questioned a particularly difficult route. "A shadow that falls in a certain way when the sun is overhead, a pattern in the moss on the rocks, things only someone who knows what to look for would notice." By nightfall, they had made good progress, but were still at least a day's journey from their destination. They found shelter in a small cave, its entrance hidden by a stand of scrub pine. Too exhausted for conversation, they shared the last of their food, a handful of berries Dawee had gathered along the way, and slept close together for warmth in the high mountain chill. The next day brought even more challenging terrain. They climbed higher, the air growing thinner, the vegetation more sparse. At times, the path seemed to disappear entirely, leaving them to scramble over loose rock or edge along narrow ledges with dizzying drops below. Gray, though no stranger to mountain travel, found himself relying entirely on Dawee's guidance. She moved with the surety of one who belongs to the land, finding handholds and footholds that he would have missed, recognizing landmarks that were invisible to his untrained eye. As the afternoon sun began its descent, they reached what appeared to be an impassable barrier, a sheer cliff face stretching across their path, with no visible way around it. "Now what?" Gray asked, scanning the cliff for some route they might have missed. Dawee smiled, a hint of mystery in her expression. "Now we find the door that is not a door." She moved along the base of the cliff, running her hands over the rock surface, searching for something. Gray watched in puzzlement until she stopped at a section that looked to him exactly like the rest. "Here," she said, indicating a narrow vertical crack in the rock. "This is the entrance." Gray looked dubious. The crack was barely wide enough to fit his arm, let alone his entire body. "You're sure?" In answer, Dawee pressed herself sideways into the crack. To Gray's amazement, she seemed to disappear into the rock itself. He followed cautiously, discovering that the crack widened once past the initial narrow opening, creating a hidden passage through the cliff. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow they had to squeeze through sideways, sometimes opening enough to walk normally. After what seemed like an eternity in near darkness, Gray saw light ahead. They emerged onto a ledge overlooking a sight that took his breath away. Below them stretched a valley, unlike any he had ever seen, a hidden paradise surrounded by towering cliffs. A stream flowed through its center, feeding a small lake that gleamed like polished silver in the late afternoon sun. Scattered throughout were stands of pine and aspen, meadows of grass and wildflowers, and, most significantly, the smoke from several small campfires. "The Valley of Shadows," Dawee said softly. "And my people are here." Gray stood in awe, understanding now why this place was sacred. It was as if they had stepped into another world, one untouched by the conflicts and changes ravaging the lands beyond. "How do we get down there?" he asked, seeing no obvious path from their high perch. Dawee pointed to what appeared to be a series of narrow ledges zigzagging down the cliff face. "That is the path. It is called the Spirit Steps. Each step must be taken with care and respect." The descent was nerve-wracking, the ledges sometimes no wider than Gray's foot, with nothing but air between him and a fatal fall. Dawee moved with practiced ease despite her size, guiding him on the more treacherous sections. As they neared the bottom, Gray could see figures moving in the camp below, several breaking away and hurrying toward the base of the cliff. By the time they reached level ground, a small crowd had gathered, women, children, and a few men, mostly elderly. There was a moment of stunned silence as the Apache took in the sight of Dawee, alive and well, accompanied by a white man. Then a cry went up, and the crowd surged forward. Dawee was engulfed in embraces, surrounded by her people, all talking at once in their language. Gray hung back, knowing this was her moment. He watched as she was reunited with her mother and sisters, saw the tears and smiles, heard the voices raised in what could only be joy and relief. Then, to his surprise, Dawee turned back to him. She extended her hand, beckoning him to join her. Hesitantly, Gray stepped forward. The crowd parted, some faces curious, others wary or openly hostile. Dawee's mother approached him, studying him with eyes that seemed to see straight to his soul. Then she reached out, taking his hand in both of hers, and spoke words Gray couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear acceptance, gratitude. "She says you have brought her daughter home," Dawee translated, her voice thick with emotion. "That you are welcome among us as family." Not everyone shared Nayland's sentiment. As they moved into the camp, Gray noticed several younger men watching him with undisguised suspicion. He kept his movements slow and non-threatening, understanding their wariness. The band had established a temporary village in the valley, with shelters constructed of branches and hides. Children played near the stream, women worked at various tasks, and hunters returned with small game. Despite the circumstances that had forced them here, there was a sense of normalcy to the scene that Gray found both surprising and heartening. That night, a council fire was lit, and the elders gathered to hear Dawee's account of her captivity and escape. Gray sat beside her, listening as she spoke in Apache, occasionally switching to English to include him in the conversation. She told of her time chained outside the sheriff's office, of Gray's intervention, of their flight and the subsequent events. When she described how they had created a diversion to help the captured Apache escape, several of the council members nodded in approval. Gray learned that 3 of those who had escaped had made it to the valley the previous day, bringing news of what had happened. "They credit you with their freedom," Dawee told him. "They saw how you drew the soldiers' fire to give them a chance to run." The council's discussion continued late into the night, touching on topics Gray could only partially understand through Dawee's translations. The future of the band, the increasing difficulty of finding safe territory, the dwindling game and resources, all were causes for concern. Finally, an elderly man who had been introduced as Taza, a respected spiritual leader, addressed Gray directly in halting English. "You come far with Dawee," he said. "Risk much. Why?" It was a simple question, but the answer was anything but simple. Gray felt all eyes on him, waiting for his response. "At first," he said carefully, "it was because it was the right thing to do. No one deserves to be chained and left to die, regardless of who they are." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "Then it was because I gave my word that I would help her reach safety." Taza's weathered face revealed nothing. "And now," he pressed, "why you still here?" Gray looked at Dawee, seated beside him, her face illuminated by the firelight. In that moment, the answer became clear to him. "Now it's because I can't imagine being anywhere else," he said simply. "Because Dawee has shown me what it means to have courage to fight for what matters. And because for the first time in my life, I feel like I'm where I belong." Dawee's eyes widened slightly at his words, a flush rising to her cheeks. Taza studied Gray intently, then nodded slowly. "Good answer," the old man declared. "Truth in your eyes." The council continued for a while longer before breaking up, people returning to their shelters for the night. Gray had been assigned a small space at the edge of the camp, with a simple sleeping mat and blanket. As he prepared to retire, Dawee approached. "Did you mean what you said?" she asked without preamble. "About feeling like you belong here," Gray nodded. "Every word. I know it won't be easy. I know some of your people will never fully accept me, but yes, I meant it." Dawee seemed to consider this, her expression thoughtful. "When I was chained outside the sheriff's office," she said slowly, "I had accepted that my life was over, that I would join my husband and son in the spirit world. Then you came with bread and kindness." She stepped closer, her height allowing her to look down into his face. "You did not just save my life, Gray Zimmerman. You gave me a reason to keep living." Gray swallowed hard, moved by her words. "Dawee," she placed a finger against his lips, silencing him. "In my culture, when a woman speaks of such things to a man, it is he who must decide the next step. I have said what is in my heart. Now you must consider what is in yours." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Gray to ponder her words long into the night. The next few days were a period of adjustment for Gray. He worked to make himself useful around the camp, helping with hunting and fishing, learning from the Apache men who were willing to teach him. Some remained distant, but others, particularly the elders, seemed to accept his presence with equanimity. He observed the rhythms of Apache life, the communal nature of their society, the respect shown to elders, the education of children, who learned by watching and participating rather than through formal instruction. Despite the difficult circumstances, there was laughter, music, storytelling around evening fires, and always there was Dawee. They didn't speak further of the feelings that had been acknowledged that night by the council fire, but something had shifted between them. A certain awareness, a sense of possibility. They worked together during the days, their cooperation now easy and natural. In the evenings, she often translated conversations for him, helping him begin to learn words and phrases in her language. A week after their arrival in the Valley of Shadows, Gray was fishing by the lake when Taza joined him. The old man settled on a rock nearby, observing Gray's technique with interest. "You catch many fish," he noted approvingly. Gray shrugged. "My pa taught me when I was a boy. Said a man who knows how to fish will never go hungry." Taza nodded sagely. "Wise father." He was quiet for a moment, then added, "You watch Dawee with heart in your eyes." Gray nearly dropped his fishing line, taken aback by the old man's directness. "Is it that obvious?" "To old eyes, yes," Taza replied with a hint of amusement. "She also watches you when you're not looking." Gray wasn't sure how to respond to this. "Her husband hasn't been gone long," he said finally. "I don't want to. It wouldn't be right to." "In Apache way," Taza explained, "when death comes in time of war, grief is honored but life continues. Nilchai would not want Dawee alone." He fixed Gray with a penetrating look. "You fear what others think. That some still see you as enemy. That's part of it," Gray admitted. "But mostly I fear I'm not worthy of her. She's extraordinary, brave, kind, strong. I'm just a drifter who spent his life running from commitment." Taza considered this. "Man who risks life for woman he just met is not just drifter," he observed. Man who chooses to live with people not his own, facing uncertain future, is not one who runs from commitment. The old man stood, preparing to leave. Think on this. Spirits bring people together for reasons, sometimes these reasons not clear at first. But path is there, if we brave enough to walk it. With those words, Taza departed, leaving Gray with much to contemplate as he continued his fishing. That evening, as the community gathered for the evening meal, Gray noticed Dawee sitting somewhat apart, gazing toward the western cliff where the setting sun painted the rock face in brilliant hues of orange and gold. On impulse, he filled 2 bowls with the fish stew he'd helped prepare and joined her. "Thought you might be hungry," he said, offering her one of the bowls. She accepted it with a smile. "Thank you. The fish you caught is very good." They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching the light change on the cliffs as the sun descended. Finally, Gray gathered his courage. "Dawee," he began, "there's something I need to say." She turned to him, her dark eyes attentive. "When I first saw you outside that general store, I didn't know what to make of you. You were unlike anyone I'd ever met, not just your height, but the way you held yourself with such dignity despite what they'd done to you." He paused, searching for the right words. "Giving you that bread was the first truly selfless thing I'd done in years, and somehow that small act changed everything." Dawee remained silent, letting him continue. "I've spent most of my adult life avoiding connections, avoiding responsibility, moving on whenever things got complicated. But with you," he met her gaze directly, "with you, I don't want to move on, I want to stay, to face whatever comes next together." A smile slowly spread across Dawee's face, warming her eyes. "Among my people," she said softly, "when a man wishes to court a woman, he speaks first to her family. Then he proves himself capable of providing for her, of protecting her." Gray nodded, understanding. "And I haven't done that." "Haven't you?" Dawee reached for his hand. "You spoke to my mother, who welcomed you as family. You helped save my people from soldiers. You have hunted and fished, sharing what you caught with all." Her fingers tightened around his. "By Apache standards, Gray Zimmerman, you have done everything right." Hope surged within him. "Does that mean?" "It means," Dawee said, her voice warm with affection, "that if you are asking to court me, my answer is yes." Gray felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a lightness filling his chest. "I am definitely asking," he confirmed, a grin spreading across his face. Dawee's answering smile was radiant. She leaned forward, her face close to his. "Then I am definitely accepting." Their first kiss was gentle, a tentative exploration that quickly deepened into something more profound. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Gray noticed several curious and amused glances from nearby Apache. "I think we've become the evening's entertainment," he observed dryly. Dawee laughed, the sound bright and joyful. "Let them look. It is good for my people to see happiness in difficult times." In the days that followed, their courtship became a source of quiet interest within the small community. There were still those who viewed Gray with suspicion, but many seemed to accept the relationship with equanimity, perhaps understanding that in these challenging times, joy should be embraced wherever it was found. Dawee's mother, in particular, appeared pleased by the development. Through Dawee's translations, Nayland told Gray stories of her daughter's childhood, how she had always been taller than others her age, how some had feared her unusual size was a bad omen, but how her father had declared it a sign of special favor from the spirits. "He would have liked you," Nayland said through Dawee. "He always said the color of a man's skin matters less than the color of his heart." As autumn deepened, bringing colder nights to the high mountain valley, the Apache Council faced difficult decisions. The Valley of Shadows, while safe, could not support their band indefinitely. Game was becoming scarcer, and the approaching winter would make survival increasingly challenging. Some argued for breaking into smaller family groups and dispersing to various remote locations until spring. Others favored attempting to reach the Northern Territories, where Gray had suggested they might find refuge. A few even proposed surrendering to the army and accepting life on the reservation, believing it preferable to slow starvation in the wilderness. Gray, now included in some council discussions due to his relationship with Dawee and his knowledge of the territories, listened more than he spoke, aware that this decision must ultimately be made by the Apache themselves. But when asked directly for his opinion, he was honest. "The Northern Territories have their own challenges," he explained. "The winters are harsh, and there are other tribes who may not welcome newcomers in their hunting grounds, but there's more space, fewer soldiers, and some areas where white settlement is still minimal." He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I know people there, traders, a few settlers who treat Indians fairly. They might help, at least with basic supplies to get through the winter." The council deliberated for several days. In the end, they decided on a compromise. The band would split into 3 groups. The largest, including most of the families with children, would attempt to reach the Northern Territories under the guidance of Gray and several experienced hunters. A smaller group, comprised mainly of elders who felt they could not make the long journey, would remain in the Valley of Shadows with enough young people to hunt and care for them. A third group, consisting of several warriors led by a man named Chato, would head west to attempt to make contact with other Apache bands rumored to be hiding in that region. The decision made, preparations began immediately. The northern group needed to depart soon, before the mountain passes became impassable with snow. Supplies were gathered, clothing repaired and reinforced for the colder climate, weapons checked and readied. On the night before their departure, a special ceremony was held. Taza, as spiritual leader, blessed their journey and called upon the ancestors to guide and protect them. Then, to Gray's surprise, the old man summoned him and Dawee to stand before the assembled community. "Before you leave," Taza said in his halting English, then continued in Apache, which Dawee translated for Gray. "He says that in times of great change it is important to honor life's celebrations as well as its sorrows," she explained. "He asks if we wish to be joined in marriage before we begin this journey, so that we may face its challenges as husband and wife." Gray's heart raced at the unexpected question. He looked at Dawee, searching her face for her feelings on the matter. "Is this what you want?" he asked softly. "It seems so sudden." Dawee's eyes were warm with affection. "In times of war and uncertainty, we do not always have the luxury of long courtships," she said. "My heart is sure. But if yours is not ready, my heart is sure," Gray interrupted, realizing as he spoke that it was absolutely true. In the short time he'd known Dawee, she had become essential to him in a way no one ever had before. "I just didn't expect. I have nothing to offer you. No home, no land. You offer yourself," she replied simply. "That is all I need." Gray turned to Taza. "Yes," he said firmly. "If Dawee will have me, I would be honored to be her husband." The Apache marriage ceremony was unlike anything Gray had witnessed before. There were no elaborate vows, no exchange of rings. Instead, Taza wrapped their hands together with a cord woven from strands of horsehair and plant fibers, symbolizing the joining of their lives. Prayers were offered to the Creator and to the ancestors of Dawee's family. Special foods were shared: cornmeal, pine nuts, and dried berries mixed with honey, each representing aspects of the life they would build together. Sustenance, sweetness, endurance. As the ceremony concluded, the community gathered around them, offering blessings and small gifts: a carved wooden comb, a leather pouch decorated with quillwork, a stone arrowhead on a cord that Gray was told had belonged to Dawee's father. Naylin approached last, her weathered face solemn as she placed her hands on their joined ones. She spoke at length in Apache, her voice carrying strength despite her age. "My mother says," Dawee translated, her voice thick with emotion, "that she gives her blessing to our union. That though it is not the marriage she might have imagined for her daughter, she sees the goodness in you and the love between us." Dawee paused, visibly moved by her mother's next words. "She says that my father once told her that the strongest trees are those that bend with the wind rather than fighting against it. That our people must be like those trees if we are to survive, adapting to new ways while keeping our roots strong in the old ways." Gray, deeply touched by Naylin's acceptance, bowed his head in respect. "Tell her I will do everything in my power to be worthy of her daughter and of her trust." When Dawee translated this, Naylin smiled and embraced him, a gesture that, coming from this traditional woman who had every reason to distrust white men, meant more to Gray than he could express. That night, a special shelter had been prepared for them at the edge of the camp, offering privacy for their first night as husband and wife. It was a simple structure of branches and hides, but it had been made comfortable with soft furs for bedding and small touches that spoke of care: juniper boughs for their fragrance, a pottery vessel of fresh water, a small fire pit prepared and ready to light. As they entered this first home of their married life, Gray felt a mixture of joy and trepidation. Dawee's height had never bothered him; if anything, he found it magnificent, a physical manifestation of her extraordinary spirit. But he was suddenly aware of the cultural differences between them, the vast gulf of experience and tradition that separated their worlds. Dawee seemed to sense his thoughts. "You are thinking too much," she observed with gentle humor, lighting the small fire. Its warm glow filled the shelter, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Gray smiled ruefully. "Guilty as charged. I want to do right by you, Dawee, and I'm not sure I know how." She moved to him, taking his hands in hers. Even now, he marveled at how her larger hands seemed to fit perfectly with his, as if designed to be joined. "There is no map for the journey we begin," she said softly. "We will find our way together." She brought his hand to her face, pressing her cheek against his palm. "Tonight, let us simply be a man and a woman who have found each other against all odds." With those words, the last of Gray's uncertainty melted away. He drew her to him, their lips meeting in a kiss that began gently but quickly deepened into something more passionate. They came together as equals, each giving and receiving with a tenderness born of genuine love rather than mere desire. Later, as they lay entwined beneath the firs, the fire burning low, Gray felt a sense of peace unlike anything he'd ever known. Dawee's head rested on his chest, her breathing deep and even. Outside, the night was still, the valley silent except for the occasional call of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. "I never expected this," he murmured, stroking her hair. "Any of it, you, this place, these people. It's like I stumbled into another life." Dawee shifted to look up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "Perhaps it is the life you were always meant to find. Perhaps all your wandering was just the path leading you here." Gray considered this, finding comfort in the thought that his years of aimless drifting might have had purpose after all. If so, it was worth every step. They fell asleep in each other's arms, two people from different worlds who had somehow found home in each other. Dawn brought the day of departure. The northern group, 27 Apache plus Gray, made their final preparations, as those staying behind gathered to bid them farewell. There were tears and embraces, especially difficult for Dawee as she said goodbye to her mother, knowing it might be the last time they saw each other. "I will come back for you," she promised, holding the older woman close. "When we have found a safe place, I will return." Naylin nodded, her face stoic despite the moisture in her eyes. "My spirit will know if you are safe, even if we do not meet again in this world." She pressed something into Dawee's hand, a small medicine pouch that had belonged to her husband. "For the journey." Then they were moving out, following the hidden path that would take them from the valley. Gray and Dawee walked together at the head of the group, leading the way through the difficult terrain. It would be several days before they reached an area where horses might be acquired for the longer journey north. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with dangers both known and unknown. They would face harsh weather, the constant threat of discovery by soldiers or hostile settlers, the challenge of finding sufficient food for their group in unfamiliar territory. Yet as Gray looked at Dawee walking beside him, her tall figure strong and proud, her face turned toward the future, he felt an optimism that defied rational assessment of their situation. Together, they had already overcome seemingly impossible odds. Together, they would face whatever lay ahead. As they crested a ridge that offered a final view of the Valley of Shadows, the group paused for a moment. Below, those who were staying behind had gathered at the valley's center, small figures raising their hands in farewell. Gray and Dawee raised their hands in return, a silent promise to carry the spirit of this place with them wherever they went. Then they turned northward, toward a future neither of them could have imagined when a quiet cowboy offered bread to a starving Apache woman chained outside a sheriff's office. A future they would build together, step by step, day by day, combining the best of both their worlds into something new. And as they walked, side by side, into that unknown future, Gray realized that after a lifetime of wandering he had finally found his way home. Not to a place, but to a person. To Dawee. To love.